The turkey was already carved when my daughter told me she wished I wasn't there. Not in those exact words. She never used exact words when she wanted to wound you. She was too clever for that. She waited until the table was full, until her husband's parents were passing the cranberry sauce and her friends from work were laughing about something on their phones, and then she said it loudly enough for everyone to hear. You know what would make this the perfect Thanksgiving, Dad? If you could just not make everything about yourself for once. The table went quiet for exactly 1 second. Then someone reached for the gravy, and the conversation moved on, and I sat there with a slice of turkey on my plate that I never ended up eating. I had driven 4 hours from Sudbury to get there. I brought 2 bottles of Ontario Cabernet, a pecan pie from the bakery on Elgin Street that she used to love as a kid, and a card with a check inside, because I didn't know what else to give a 31-year-old woman who seemed to have everything except patience for her father. The check was for $800. I'd written Happy Thanksgiving, Love Dad in the card and spent 10 minutes deciding whether to add an X or not. I added 1. Then I crossed it out. Then I drove 4 hours north on the 69 and stood at her door holding a pie box and a bottle of wine under each arm, and she'd opened the door and said, "Oh, you're early," like I was a mild inconvenience. I should back up. My wife, my daughter's mother, passed away 11 years ago. Ovarian cancer, stage 4, caught too late. Her name was Margaret, and she was the kind of woman who remembered every birthday in the extended family, who kept a notebook in her purse with other people's coffee orders in it, who cried at RNLI commercials, even though we'd never been to Britain. When she died, my daughter Petra was 20 and I was 52, and we both handled it badly in completely different ways. I threw myself into work. She threw herself into needing me. For 2 years after Margaret died, Petra called me almost every day, sometimes twice. She'd moved back home for a while, and then when she left for Toronto, I was the one she phoned when she had a bad date, a hard week, a confusing conversation with her landlord. I was glad to be needed. I didn't realize until much later that what she needed and what she was taking were 2 different things. By the time she was 26, I had co-signed her car loan because her credit was thin. By 27, I was covering half her rent during a stretch when she was between jobs. By 28, I'd lent her, and I used the word lent even though we both knew what it meant. $11,000 for a kitchen renovation in an apartment she didn't own. Her landlord benefited from that renovation. I chose not to think about it. I wasn't a foolish man. I was a retired civil engineer from a mid-sized city in northern Ontario who had managed budgets and timelines and structural load calculations for 30 years. I understood risk. I understood carrying capacity. I understood what happens when you put more weight on a beam than it was designed to hold. I just never applied any of that to my own family. Her husband, she married Reese when she was 29, a pleasant enough man who worked in digital marketing and had opinions about coffee beans. He never asked me for anything directly. He didn't need to. Petra did the asking and Reese did the benefiting, and somehow I was always the one standing at the end of it. With my wallet lighter and my phone full of texts I'd answered at 11 o'clock at night. The Thanksgiving dinner was not the first time she'd said something like that in public. There had been a birthday dinner 2 years before where she'd told her friends that I had always been emotionally unavailable, which landed oddly given that I was sitting 2 feet away from her. There had been a Christmas where she'd criticized how I'd loaded the dishwasher in a tone that made her mother-in-law look at her shoes. There had been a Father's Day of all days, where she'd given a little speech at brunch about how she'd basically raised herself after her mom died. I had smiled through all of it. I don't know why. Some combination of grief and guilt and the bone-deep fear that if I pushed back, she would disappear from my life the way Margaret had. Suddenly and permanently and without any warning at all. After the Thanksgiving dinner, I drove back to Sudbury. 4 hours alone on the highway in the dark. The pecan pie was still in the back seat. She hadn't touched it, and I hadn't offered to leave it. I stopped at a Tim Hortons somewhere past Parry Sound, sat in the parking lot with a double-double I didn't want, and looked at the trees in the dark and thought, I'm 63 years old and I'm afraid of my own daughter. That was the thing I hadn't let myself say out loud before. I didn't do anything dramatic when I got home. I didn't send a long email or call her in a fury or make any declarations. I went to bed, woke up, made oatmeal, and started paying attention in a way I hadn't before. Over the next 6 weeks, I kept a list. Not out of spite, I want to be clear about that, but because I am an engineer by training, and when something isn't working, you assess. I wrote down what I spent, what I was asked for, what happened when I said yes, and what happened when I said no. I wrote down how many times she called, and what the calls were about, and how I felt after. What I found was that I said yes far more than I said no, and that when I said no, she stopped calling for about 2 weeks and then called again as if nothing had happened, and that when I said yes, nothing changed. She didn't call more warmly or appreciate me more visibly. The yes was just absorbed, like water into dry ground, and then there was another ask. I also found, and this was the one that sat with me, that I couldn't remember the last time she had called just to see how I was. At Christmas that year, she called to ask if I could transfer $500 because they were short on the hydro bill. I said I'd think about it and call her back. She didn't follow up for 3 weeks, which told me the hydro bill situation had resolved itself. In February, I turned 64 and spent the day cross-country skiing on the Laurentian trails behind the university, which I had started doing again after years of not, because Margaret and I had skied those trails together in our 30s, and I'd stopped after she died. I made pasta for dinner, opened one of the bottles of Ontario Cabernet I'd taken back from Thanksgiving, and sat by the window watching the snow come down. Petra texted at 9:30 that evening. Happy day, Wes. No call. I'm not going to pretend I wasn't hurt. I was. But something had shifted in me on that highway between Parry Sound and Sudbury in November, and it had kept shifting since. I was tired of performing gratitude for being allowed to give things away. In March, I called a financial advisor I'd been putting off calling for 2 years, a woman in Sudbury named Beverly from my old colleague's firm, and had an honest conversation about my retirement position. I was comfortable, not wealthy. The house was paid off, my pension from the province was solid, but I'd been drawing down a line of credit in ways I hadn't been entirely transparent with myself about, and a meaningful portion of it traced back to $11,000 in car loans and a long list of smaller things. Beverly asked me what my goals were. I told her I wanted to stop bleeding money I'd earned over 40 years of work. She nodded and said, "Then you need to stop." She didn't say it unkindly. I started saying no in April, not dramatically. Just no, I'm sorry, I can't do that right now. A request from Petra for $2,000 toward a vacation to Portugal. No. A request to co-sign a lease on a new apartment they were moving into. No, I'm not in a position to do that. A request for my credit card number just temporarily to hold a reservation for something. No. After the third no, she stopped calling. I waited. 2 weeks, 4 weeks. A card arrived in early May for Mother's Day, which was addressed to me. She'd done this a few times since Margaret died, sent me a Mother's Day card, and I had always found it touching and a little sad. I wrote back a brief note, nothing confrontational, just thank you for thinking of me, I hope you're well. She called in June. I picked up. You've been really weird since Christmas, she said. I've been well, I said. How are you? Reese and I are fine. Dad, are you upset with me about something? I thought about that Thanksgiving table, the gravy being passed, the 1 second of silence. I've been doing some thinking, I said, about how we communicate, about what our relationship has looked like for the past few years. Okay, she said slowly, and? and I think I'd like it to look different. She asked me what that meant. I told her I wasn't going to be available for financial requests anymore. Not because I didn't love her, but because I'd realized that the money had become a substitute for something neither of us had named, and it wasn't helping either of us. I told her I would very much like to see her for its own sake, not as a transaction, not as a problem to be solved. I told her I'd been grieving her mother for 11 years, and I thought she might have been too, and that maybe we'd both been handling it in ways that weren't serving us well. There was a long silence. "So you're punishing me," she said. "No," I said, "I'm changing." She hung up after a few more minutes, not angry exactly, more like someone who had expected a different kind of resistance and didn't know what to do with this kind. I sat on my back porch with my coffee and listened to the neighborhood sounds. A lawnmower somewhere. Kids on the street. A cardinal in the birch tree at the back of the yard that Margaret had planted years ago. I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, which was simply my own presence in my own life. I should tell you what happened with the money, because it matters. The $11,000. I wrote it off in my own ledger. Gone. I had lent it without a contract, and I would have lost that argument in any small claim setting. And more importantly, chasing it would have cost me something I valued more than money, which was my own dignity. I absorbed it and moved on. What I did do was call my lawyer, a methodical man in my old firm's network named Edmund, and update my will, not out of anger. Out of clarity. I had 2 nephews I'd been neglecting for years. My late brother's boys, now in their 30s, both working. Both reasonable people I'd let drift from my life. I redirected a portion of what would have been Petra's inheritance toward a charitable bequest for the Sudbury Regional Hospital's oncology ward, which felt right given how Margaret had gone. The rest of the estate remained with Petra, but structured through a trust with conditions that Edmund helped me draft. If she contested it, she'd forfeit her portion. If she accepted it, she'd receive it in installments over 5 years, not as a lump sum. Edmund raised an eyebrow when I walked him through it. "That's thorough," he said. "I'm an engineer," I said. "I don't like things left unsupported." In August, Petra called again. This time, the tone was different, quieter. She asked if we could meet. I said yes. We had lunch at a restaurant near her apartment in Toronto that she chose, a small Italian place where the tables were close together and the pasta was better than anything I could have justified making myself. She didn't apologize in a clean, direct way. She's not built for that, and I've accepted it. What she did was talk about her mother, about what those years had been like, about how she'd been seeing a therapist since January, and how that had been harder than she expected. She said she knew she'd been asking too much of me. Not in those words, but close enough. I told her about the skiing, about the bottle of Cabernet on my birthday, about Beverly and the financial planning. I told her that I'd spent a long time being afraid that setting limits would mean losing her, and that I had finally understood that the version of us that existed inside those limits was not a relationship worth keeping. She cried a little. I did too, briefly, which surprised me. We didn't fix everything that afternoon. You don't at 64, sitting in a small Italian restaurant in Toronto while strangers eat their pappardelle 3 feet away. But we agreed to try something different. To call without a reason. To see each other without an agenda. On the drive back up the 400 somewhere north of Barrie, where the trees close in on both sides and the sky opens up the way it does in northern Ontario in late summer, I thought about Margaret. About what she would have made of all of this. She would have gotten there faster than me. She always did. She had a gift for seeing the structure of her problem while I was still measuring the inputs. I think she would have told me what I eventually had to tell myself, that loving someone and being used by them are not the same thing, and that knowing the difference is not a betrayal, it's just seeing clearly. The cardinal came back to the birch tree the following spring. I don't know if it was the same one. I like to think it was. There's a moment I keep coming back to. Not the dinner, Not the silence after she spoke, but the parking lot. The Tim Hortons somewhere past Perry Sound. Dark trees on every side. A cup of coffee going cold in my hand. That was the moment something in me finally stopped pretending. I spent a long time thinking the problem was that I hadn't given enough. More money, more patience, more of myself held quietly in reserve so she'd never feel the weight of her mother being gone. What I understand now is that I had it exactly backwards. Every time I said yes without being asked to reflect on what I was agreeing to, I was teaching Petra that I didn't have edges, that I was a resource, not a person. You can love someone completely and still teach them the wrong things about who you are. That's the part that took me the longest to see clearly. Not because I lacked the intelligence. I'd spent 30 years reading structural drawings and catching what others missed. But there's a particular kind of blindness that comes from grief and from guilt and from loving someone so much that you'd rather absorb damage than watch them struggle. I was sharp about everything except the thing that mattered most. What finally moved me wasn't anger, it was honesty. Sitting with Beverly and looking at a spreadsheet of my own finances. Calling Edmund and updating a will I'd let go stale. Lacing up my ski boots alone on a February morning and going back to trails I'd abandoned because they reminded me of Margaret. Each of those was a small act of clarity, and clarity, I've learned, is a kind of courage. Not the dramatic kind, not the kind that announces itself. The quiet kind, the kind that says, I see this situation as it actually is, and I am going to act accordingly, even if it costs me something. The thing about Petra is that she wasn't a bad person. She was a young woman who lost her mother at 20 and leaned into the one parent she had left, until the leaning became a habit and the habit became an expectation. I let that happen. I don't say that to punish myself, I say it because it's true, and because the truth of it is what made change possible. If I'd gone on telling myself she was simply ungrateful, I would have stayed bitter. Understanding my own part in it let me do something about it instead. She called me in June and I picked up. We had lunch in August and we both cried a little, which neither of us planned. None of that would have happened if I'd kept absorbing, kept enabling, kept smiling through dinners where I wasn't welcome. The cardinal came back to Margaret's birch tree the following spring. I don't know if it was the same one. But I was there to see it, present in my own yard, in my own life, in my own skin. And that, after everything, felt like more than enough.